for those of you who didn't hear, how much of music containing an element of story? Yeah, I've thought about that. See, I think even without words, music can tell a story. I mean, if you just listen to Somewhere Over the Rainbow, it jumps up an octave rather than going down an octave, and then at the very end it goes up to that top note again. And a lot of music does tell a story that way. And then that's why when you add text that tells a story, as it was very common in folk music and in ballads, most of them are not about, here's how I feel right now. They're often stories. And often the feeling is conveyed not through, gee, I feel this way. I feel this way, I feel this way, I feel this way, I feel this way. It's conveyed by the listener's participation in the narrative, which produces the feeling. If it's well told, it produces what Aquinas called co-natural knowledge. That is, the experience of the art brings with it something of the experience of the thing that is being described. And that's what really great works do. I was thinking about it in terms of popular music. When I was a teenager, one of the kind of crossover hits of the 60s, or late 60s, early 70s, was Bobby Gentry's Ode to Billy Joe. Not Billy Joel, not Ode to Billy Joel. The day Billy Joe McAllister fell off the Tallahatchie Bridge. We still don't know what happened on that bridge. But so here's this like 5 or 6 verse ballad, which follows, I mean, you know, this is an ancient form of storytelling. And the music fits the necessity of telling the story. She sang it almost expressionless. There wasn't a lot of emotion going into that. But there is a kind of haunting emotion that comes with the story. I don't know how many popular songs today. I also thought of a much less compelling song, Cher's "Gypsies, Tramps, and Thieves," which was also a ballad, or "Wichita Lineman," which was a ballad. Now, some country music still has that ballad. These were all crossover hits that got onto the pop charts. And it'd be interesting to know if ballads, that is, storytelling songs, can sell as much. I kind of think not. I think that, again, part of it's the way music is experienced. It used to be you'd go out and buy a record and come home and have to sit down and put it on a turntable and sit there and play it through loudspeakers, which almost required, I mean, you could do other things while it was playing, but the technology invited, first of all, a shared experience. Most people didn't have headphones. I was one of the geeky high school kids who did have headphones, actually. So I mean, there are a lot of factors that combine in this. But I think that when the music isn't being used to tell a story, then the musical structure doesn't need to have a kind of narrative developmental shape to it as well. So I think that's part of it. And again, I think music is much more about mood, instant mood, than popular music probably has ever been. So I think that's definitely part of it. But now, I think there's a bigger, if I can get cosmic for a minute. There's a great article that was in First Things magazine years ago. In fact, the editor of First Things once told me this was the most downloaded article. It was Robert Jensen's How the World Lost Its Story. And it's an article about how in contemporary culture, I mean, most cultures believe that there's a story to tell about the world and that we live in an intelligible world. We live in a narratable world, I think was his term. And that's how religions tell stories about the origins and destinies of worlds. He says most people don't think we live in a narratable world now. Or if we do, that physicists and biochemists tell the narration, but it's not a very interesting story when it comes down to it. Now, see, I think in a society in which we lost confidence, not just in the order of creation, but in the idea that there's a narrative order, that there's a story about history, it's not surprising that our art forms become less narrative, more kind of micro-episodic, describing this little snapshot moment in people's experience. I mean, you look at painting in this, well, I was going to say 16th, 17th century, but you go back farther than that. Paintings from that illustrate scenes from biblical stories or from mythology. And everybody knew the stories, and the painting was resonating with people's memory and knowledge of the story, and the moral formation and communal formation that they had, or national formation that they had, as connected to that narrative in some way. You know, when we live in a time when that's rarely the case anymore, and so it's not surprising that our styles of art move to reflect that. So yeah, the question back there. To talk about learning how to listen, what do you need to do? Do you need to learn how to read music? I don't think you need to learn how to read music. My friend Jack Redford, the composer, Hollywood composer, has, because the people at his church know he's a composer, some college students approached him and said, teach us, we'd like to learn more about how to listen to music. So he brings them over to his house, and he played some music for them. And what he did, he took some music that involved what are called theme and variations, where you take a melody and then you harmonize it in one way, and then you kind of invert the melody or you do something with it you play variations on the melody. And this is something jazz performers do all the time, and classical composers have done forever. And he played the basic theme, and he said most of the young people he was with couldn't hear the melody. They didn't know where the melody was. So they weren't used to listening for a melodic line and couldn't tell where the melody was. So I'd say, I mean, the first thing to do is just take time to listen to it. I mean, we were talking at dinner about a book written back originally in the 1930s by Aaron Copland called What to Listen For in Music, where he talks about basic elements of melody, harmony, and rhythm, and knowing what kinds of things to listen for. So in a case of a melody, I mean, listen to Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Is it going up or down at various points? When does it go up? When does it go down? When does it kind of hover in one place? And what's going on there? So just, first of all, just active listening of the shape of the thing. And then, I mean, one of the things I think is sad is that we don't have more. I read a lot about music, and I tend to read more about classical music and popular music, but when I read about popular music, almost all the writing is about the lives of the performers, or what happened in the studio, or how big a hit this is going to be. Very little, it's about the music. And there's a huge amount of music, of writing about music. I read the New Yorker pop music critic, Sasha Frere-Jones, I read regularly, and occasionally he will connect with a musical element in the music. And he actually is better than most. But the reason I mention that is if you can read good commentary about music and then listen to the music that's in question. There's a guy, I'll recommend Robert Capello, who wrote two books, one called All You Have to Do Is Listen, and one called What Makes It Great. And these came out of lectures that he did before concerts at Lincoln Center, of classical music, and everything from Renaissance choral music to 20th century orchestral music. And what he would do is he'd give actually often a 90-minute presentation before a concert, which makes kind of a long afternoon or evening. Actually, I guess they were closer to about 70 minutes long, where he would kind of take apart the music and kind of walk people through. I saw one he did recently about a setting of a text of an Ave Maria by Palestrina, 16th century Italian composer. And he'll play a little piece of the melody, and then he'll have the audience sing along, and then he'll rewrite it. He'll say, okay, here's my inferior version of this melody. Now sing this horrible version of this melody, this really stupid version, and everybody sings it. He says, okay, that's the premiere and the last performance of that piece of music. Now you're going to hear what Palestrina does with just a few little melodic changes. He does this up here and he does this down here, and hear how much better that melody is. He has two books, like I said, What Makes It Great, and All You Have to Do Is Listen. And then you go to iTunes and download a whole bunch of video podcasts, which are recordings of his lectures. And just follow along. I think a lot of it is, I don't think you need to be able to read music. It does help, but I think you just need to know what kinds of things to listen for. Yeah, over here.
How does that fit? Because it's very simple.
Yeah. So where does Gregorian chant fit, or Taizé chant, with what? The complexity, a complex structure? Yeah. Okay. A lot of composers, I just was reading, well, actually, you can go online. There's a Scottish composer named James Macmillan. He's a Roman Catholic. He writes orchestral music and chamber music, but he writes a lot of sacred choral music also. And he's very active in a local parish, and he writes music for worship in that local parish. And he has just started an organization called Musica Sacra Scotland, which is dedicated to recovering the use of chant in congregations by parishioners, not by choirs, because he believes that chant is the most elemental form of music. He said when he was studying musical composition, one of the most helpful exercises he had, and you can see him say this in a video on their website, was write a chant-like melody. Write a melody that's chantable. Write a melody that has aspects of chant in it. And he said you begin to learn about musical structure and development by doing that. And that, he says, that is at, and I've heard a lot of other 20th century composers say the same thing, that knowing how chant works, you begin to learn how everything that came since chant works, that actually still has that kind of meaning and intelligibility about it. So what happens in the Renaissance, or shortly before, or late medieval period, is you begin the development of multiple voices in parallel, sometimes in parallel, but often in counterpoint. That is, they're overlapping but not doing the same thing at the same time, which is like 4 or 5 lines of chant interacting with each other. And in a sense, what happens if chant is 2-dimensional, this kind of music is 3-dimensional. It has a kind of depth about it. And so you begin to listen to it and realizing that it interestingly, polyphony, it's called polyphony, that kind of writing. Polyphony is discovered at the same time that perspective begins to play an important role in visual arts. So the idea of a visual depth rather than a simple flat plane emerges at about the same time in Western history, which is fascinating. And I don't think it's any accident. I also think that it's no accident that multi-voice music arises in a Trinitarian culture. You don't have a lot of multi-voice music in Islamic cultures. Only in the last 20 years has Iranian classical music allowed more than one voice at a time. And I think, well, if you're a deeply committed Unitarian, you're not going to delight in the interaction of equal voices, which is what happens in early polyphony. So I think the chant, the simple and often rhythmically complex, because chant doesn't follow a 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's interesting to me that kind of rhythmic intensity emerges in the West when machines become dominant. The fact that we have drum machines is an interesting kind of cultural story. But the emphasis on regular rhythm emerges almost at the same time that a fascination with efficiency and quantitative, a move from a kind of organic, unpredictable mode of perception and creation to a mechanical, predictable mode of creation happens. And that's a very interesting thing that's going on as well. But but composers still work with chant elements as basic functions of much more complex. So it still is a kind of organizing basic unit. There was another, yes.
What impact does that have?
Well, yeah, what impact does basically the technical capacity of recordings and playback, and the fact that anyone can now more recently distribute music that's heard by millions of people. I think a number of things. First of all, we tend to listen more episodically. So I'm driving in the car, I'm listening to Brahms' First Symphony, I get halfway through the second movement, I stop, I get out, I go into Whole Foods, I buy some whatever. I come back, I pick up the second half of the second movement. That's a weird, unnatural experience. I've just committed a horribly unnatural act here, because now some people watch movies that way. I can't watch a movie that way. I can't like stop a movie in the middle and then come back and watch the second half of it the next day or something. But we do tend to listen. We do a lot of listening because the recording allows it to be that way. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, even more profoundly, we're not used to making music with each other as much as we did. So when people bought sheet music, it's because recordings weren't as easily available. And no kid went out to buy records. It's only in the late 1950s that kids had disposable income. The teenager, the teenager, and only arises in the late 1940s. The word isn't used until like 1947. So, and the idea of youth culture and music as part of youth culture, that's a totally new phenomenon. Partly because of the technology that enables it. But so we don't sing, we typically don't make music together unless you're in a garage band of some kind. Almost no one makes music with their family. The churches are the only places left, and even in most churches that's not the case. So to grow up, I grew up in a church where the whole family we sang together. We sang together at home, we sang together in church. It was just kind of the normal thing to do. And so music was part of a communal experience, which it is, even I often am amazed at the experience in British pubs of people singing together, or the football fans. I think all of the big football, what we call soccer teams, have songs that associate with the teams. And, our rowdy football people paint their bodies strange colors and wear strange hats made of cheese or something. They do that, but then they sing about it too. So for some reason, outside of the church, we don't have a tradition of communal singing. Which, so in a sense, I don't know which comes first. Is the communal singing abandoned, and then the record companies and iTunes kind of fills the gap, fills the vacuum? But I think that's a huge problem. And then related to that, and I'll just mention quickly, the loss of any idea of cultural authority linked to music. So music was always received as being part of a culture, part of a folk. The difference between popular music and folk music isn't just musical style. The difference between popular music and folk music is that folk music was received from an intergenerational continuity that was part of a community that was also concerned with moral matters. So, you didn't learn a song from your uncle that encouraged licentiousness because people knew that wasn't a good thing to tell young Johnny that he ought to do. But marketers have no problems promoting songs that promote licentiousness because they're not accountable to any kind of cultural authority or communal continuity. They're not worried about the next generation. So that's a huge. So the configuration of music outside of communities, outside of communities with a kind of trajectory. Again, I don't think it's impossible to recover that, and I think the church may be the only community that can recover that. I often I'm music director at my church, and we sing music from 800 years of musical experience regularly, and I always tell my congregation that this is our folk music, this is our folk tradition. It starts with Gregorian chant, and we have Maurice Duraflé and James Macmillan who's writing the next chapter of our folk music. But that mentality is, again, it's not impossible to recover. If I can say one more thing about families, I think one of the biggest challenges of raising kids is to get them, for Christian parents, is to get them to have the church as their primary community of identity rather than their age group as their primary community of identity. And I think that moral formation happens within the context of a community that exerts a kind of binding address of moral authority. And if you have a sense that your principal sense of moral membership is in the group that wears a certain kind of clothes or listens to certain music, or rather than in a community that does have moral authority, it's really hard to build anything like character or conscience. I'd recommend James Hunter's book, The Death of Character, which really deals with that really well. Character as a sociological phenomenon. And I think shared musical traditions, shared musical repertoire is a way of binding people into a sense of membership in a community that's really unique. But when the technology enables people to be what I call autoculturalist, that is a culture of one, not multicultural, but I'm my own culture and I choose my own repertoire. I make my own playlist. That eliminates that sense of moral accountability in a significant way.